is, like I said, Mike Bunner. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a senior security automation engineer at the REI Co-op. We're US-based, and we're a fairly new team. We brought, instead of an MSSP, we came back in, and automation was at the forefront of our CSOC. Our organization's motto and ethos is, a life outdoors is a life well lived. And I believe we achieved some of that with automation. My first conference was in Montreal 2 years ago. And I left with more new GitHub repos starred than I probably knew what to do with, whether from the talks or from just meeting other people. And so when I named this like only seeing stars, I really feel like I have just more stars and not enough time. So in the last couple of years, we started thinking about what is it that we are kind of running into as roadblocks in just adoption and getting stuff into production. And by production, for me, it needs to be not running ad hoc in my laptop. It needs to be in SOAR, CI/CD, a Lambda, something that's not just on the laptop. Unfortunately, most of these really well-made scripts don't have any sort of standard. They end up being maybe dump to screen, maybe it's a JSON, YAML, who knows, syslog. So I still find myself doing ETLs, which, for those that may not be familiar with the word, it's, extract, transact, load. So basically, get something out, kind of change the data set in a way that I need it, and load it into something else. So I would love to tell you that I spend all my day in automation getting to play in SOAR playbooks. Unfortunately, the real world in automation is you're working in ETLs a lot. So that is one of the places that kind of prevents me from being able to more quickly adopt these scripts into production. Because the truth is, your script's output can become someone else's script's input. And so if we start standardizing on a schema and a framework, we can much more easily chain these together. So leading into that, the reverse engineering point solutions. So when I'm looking at trying to find solutions, I'm finding pieces of data on GitHub for one aspect, maybe a Reddit thread for another, and then some of my own tools, and I'm kind of collecting them together. And maybe I do update, I have to go into your script and rip out some of the pieces. I don't use that vendor, so I need to rewrite the script. I see some new aspects, I update my script. You may or may not end up being told about it, and then you have to go into my script, rip out my pieces, and then update your script. So we're not efficient right now at all. So commercial SOAR kind of does this for you. SOAR, security orchestration, automation response. It's very simple, really. It's despite how much we pay for these tools. You have a thing, an event, maybe it's run ad hoc by your analysts, or some sort of scheduled event. Comes in, it's we have like an input, we run some sort of code, it could be APIs, it could be simple logic, filtering, and we get an output. Most SOAR tools have their own parsers that work reasonably well for JSON. Now, what happens in the mapping area is instead of a standard, they're just kind of using the GUI to say, this output becomes this action's input, and then this repeats. Unfortunately, as you build your SOAR product and expand your use cases, the real big problem is vendor lock-in. And for those that maybe are not familiar with the term, vendor lock-in is essentially an organizational risk where you are losing leverage in contract negotiations because it is harder to remove this tool. And as that happens, the vendors know this. I'm glad they're maybe aren't hearing this. And just as a sidebar for vendor lock-in, the greater vendor lock-in you have, the more time you need to give yourself in those contract negotiations. So if you have a brand new SOAR product, don't have a lot of playbooks, yeah, you could do a contract negotiations 30 days out. But let's say you have 400 playbooks and they raised the prices, they got bought out, there's some reason you can't use them anymore. You should be looking at maybe a 6-month negotiation, because that'll give you the time. Like I said, it really comes down to that leverage. I have a SOAR tool, I like my SOAR tool, but I also see, I'm always thinking about lock-in. So essentially what we are missing at its core, we have the scripts, we have our playbooks, we have our processes, but we're really missing some sort of standard. And I started seeing this in many of our projects and automations that we were building. So I kind of looked around to see what would fit and what would be an ideal candidate. To me, I needed 4 primary things. It needed to capture complex objects. So just not a list. I love lists. I feel like a lot of my job is maintaining lists, but I really need more complex objects. Of course, some way that they become extendable. So, I don't want to use some sort of tool where it shows the last update was 3 years ago. No one's really working on it anymore. Having that nice support would be great. And finally, I want it to be free and open source. There's a few tools, frameworks, but they're still locked into that vendor and they aren't licensed under an open source licensing. I will just quickly point out, Elastic Common Schema, which, even though it says Elastic, is Apache 2, and it is a pretty decent for some easier event-based. It's not in scope for this talk, but if you're looking at something for event generation, this is a great one to use. And I did look at some, Yara, Stix, and OpenIOC, but truly, the OCSF is what I eventually landed on as what I found to be the most useful for my work. It is extensible and structured, community-driven. They joined the Linux Foundation last November, and they have a great guides on contribution. Anybody in this room can contribute to the OCSF. And I love that it's vendor agnostic. It even uses that exact phrase on their website. It's really interesting that it's backed by really large vendors, including quite a few, up on these banners. So I don't believe it's going anywhere anytime soon. And just some of them, it's like I said, CSPs, big enterprise security products, IDPs, issue tracking, and data pipelines. So, landscape shift a little bit. Legitimate but abused software. And this is where I believe the open source community really came through for us in the last year, is, identifying and communicating, these just aren't like a C2 thing. It's like, no, you might have trouble blocking it, but you should definitely pay attention to it. And but there wasn't a really good way to describe it. How do you describe S3 being abused? How do you describe some aspects of like Cloudflare or other, like, there's many, many of these tools that are unfortunately abused. And especially if we're customers of these tools, it's even harder to address them. And most of the time, it will be org-specific solutions because maybe someone's like, oh, we don't use DocuSign. Well, we do. I can't block DocuSign. But so that becomes very difficult to deal with. And worst of all, like these tools that we spend so much money on end up missing them. A lot of our purple team exercises are often run entirely in living off the land. So they're flying right through a lot of our detections that we then have to improve. So every time we do it, we end up fixing posture detections. A small purple team exercise ends up creating a ton of actual work later. And like I said, the free and open source community really delivered this last year in particular. And with that, I mean things like, your LOL RMM, you're tracking, living off trusted sites, living off trusted tunnels, all of these things that just hide in plain sight, and your vendors aren't always, seeing them. People had proof of concepts, people were creating, a lot of Sigma rules for these, and interestingly, like, a lot of the vendors, they were using these community-driven sites to drive their own detections. Unfortunately, it was kind of a plucky bunch of vertebrates on the Fediverse generating a lot of those data sets. And so it's, and some of them you might see point solutions. So you're like, great, I need to address this, but it's on this one specific vendor's subreddit. Okay, it doesn't help me a lot. Still a lot of other work, and it might be unstructured data. It's like, here's a GitHub markdown that's just of the processes. Another GitHub markdown is just of the URLs. So that becomes a little bit problematic. And what I started finding was I needed a way to capture static or semi-static objects in OCSF. And the object in particular that I found the most useful in it, because if you go into OCSF, you'll find very quickly, like, what do I choose? There's not really a good guide right now. It's kind of just, here's a schema, here's some examples, have at it. But there's an OSINT object that's pretty well built, that's very useful. So what we found was, when we're dealing like with, remote management and monitoring, we need multiple solutions. If you are just relying on your vendor to handle remote monitoring, it's not enough. Some of these tools might need, you're like, I have a URL list. Well, some of these might not work because the root URL is apple.com. You're probably not going to block apple.com. So you might need a application-aware firewall to handle some of this, or you might need an EDR to handle some of this. The problem is these lists are completely different in how they work with different tools. So you end up with addressing the same RMM in different ways for different tools. And that is, for us, was kind of difficult. But what's nice about that object is, I have all the pieces I need for, domains, executables, to basically be a single object to distribute to those different solutions, which would include firewall, web proxies, for an allow, or maybe you have a certain one that you only allow in a block. Unfortunately, there isn't really a standard also for blocking, URLs and wildcards. So when I build a block list, I'm building several different varieties of them. But having this allows me to build just one automation for just one type of SACE or firewall tool, instead of like point solution for every single thing. And it's, again, the same tool, I can then use as a distribution point. And of course, removal scripts. So just because you blocked it, you still need to go back. Maybe you're catching up with an org. I know mergers and acquisitions deal with this a lot. It's like, oh, what did we get? So a lot of removal scripts are a big piece of dealing with this. Another really useful object that we found was just something, just describing a software as a service, and it's, it might be a root domain, but there's a lot of other things that I need to know about that software. Is there some sort of other endpoint that's used for hosting static, but domainless but free hosting on it? That maybe I can block just that part or build detections there. Maybe I just need to know extra information about it. So this really helps us deal with, kind of combine it together, because otherwise what we were finding is it was multiple lists separate to describe the same, object. But again, with being able to describe complex data structures in one type, that also means I can package it up and share it to someone else. In this case, a more recent one that I really like is starting to capture what the login URLs are for a lot of software. So I might not care a lot about, if I don't use a certain cloud service provider or domain registrar, I might not want to block like GoDaddy, but I might block the login page to GoDaddy. So that is a very cheap CASB in that sense, to kind of make sure that there isn't that sprawl of unauthorized tooling. And abuse reporting, which I know we're seeing a lot more people trying to automate and trying to handle, either to that particular vendor or whatever that software service is, or even packaging those up and sending those to maybe a third party who handles those for you. And in this example, this was just one of our in-house scripts. And I was like, all right, this was like one of my first attempts, like, let's really get OCSF into my script and generate it. This script was kind of a domain generation script where we so it's kind of like a souped up DNS twist, which is a pretty ubiquitous and beloved tool at this point. But so I take a lot of I have kind of like a configuration file of some of my subdomains, some of the tools we use and assets, and it just generates a whole lot of domains, domain variations. Some of them might be the common, SSO hyphen your domain.com. Retail, hospitality, and fintech kind of have a unique domain variation where you end up with like domain hyphen a location, maybe a city or a country in which you exist. So being able to block brand, hyphen seattle.com might be something that we would preemptively block or look for. So taking our subdomains, so if you use a particular piece of discoverable subdomains, maybe making sure that that subdomain, the hyphenated version of it, is blocked or monitored. And that really helped us because we were able to just regenerate this list every once in a while as needed and push it to our email gateways or firewalls. We'll kind of look in the SIEM to see, just make sure it doesn't exist anywhere, and start doing some basic whois search. And that one's mostly for like the brand protection type of stuff. These more to protect your SSO company name. This one more for retail. It's common to have like companycoupons.com or something. So that's really what this one was addressing. Software removal was probably one of the biggest impetuses in why I started using this object. A lot of the stuff I was finding were very point solutions, buried in Reddit, GitHub. I often had to go to, into my sandbox and load it, and then pick out pieces. And once we got a really good reusable software removal script, I found myself building my own YAML and almost structured data. And I think today, especially in this room in particular, seems to be the reoccurring theme of the XKCD standards. So it was like, I probably shouldn't just make another one of these. Let's see what's out there. And software removal is kind of interesting because it is security, but security where it also meets kind of endpoint and client engineering. Because there's many reasons you would remove software. You'd remove not just for, it's security. We're used to like taking the big hammer and flattening a machine. But if you're removing software due to just like licensing risks, maybe there's privacy changes, some sort of other rules. Even today, there's geopolitical reasons why someone might remove software from a company. You're not just going to flatten a whole bunch of machines. That would be disruptive to the business. Unfortunately, a lot of uninstallations are terrible and not well automated. I've seen uninstallations where they have the uninstall file, but they don't even add it to like the Windows registry, so can't trigger it. And even then, it leaves many artifacts that I might want to get rid of. So that one, that's one that we've been building, but I would love a way to have a place to, share that. It's like, all right, here's a script that's reusable. I know it works on several different vendor solutions. Now we can start building repos so we can separate the logic from like the what is the object. And we're not going to get locked into any sort of, Mike's random his version of YAML. And there are many more use cases using this exact same OS int object. We have, like I said, abuse reporting. Maybe we want to know what the API sources are. We could start applying those. So it's not just about blocking stuff. It could also be about what we need to apply. So knowing, for our email policies and SPF, for those that might be in GRCP, there's a lot of stuff we can maybe start doing with vendor and license management and third-party, tooling. Understanding, even knowing the privacy pages, because there's a lot of things we can start monitoring. Like, whoa, you had a privacy change that doesn't meet our company standards or maybe even your country's rules. So we could start monitoring some of those aspects. Another one that's very useful is the stock market tickers. So 8K is to the United States, but it is really useful to start knowing if this is a public company and where those breach notifications are. Sometimes they're good about working with their customers. Other times you get to find out with everybody else. And of course, operations are good. Knowing RSS feeds to a particular software, so you can start automating those types of alerting. But having these all together, because it's that reinventing the wheel. Like, if I already did this, why would you have to go out and do this too? I'd rather just share some sort of common object that we could keep expanding on. Some lessons learned. There's not really a good guide on how to use OCSF right now. The vendors have whole teams, which is nice for them. But for me, it was, all right, here's my IDE. On my other screen, here's some examples and the schema. All right, start browsing and seeing what's going to work for you. Application didn't quite work. What about OSINT? And the generative AI did okay. It would keep being like, yeah, you should make these findings. I'm like, that's not really what I want. So, and it would often hallucinate. So it really had to be strict with what I wanted from the generative AI to be remotely accurate. So it was good for ideas, but right now we can't entirely trust it. Luckily, OCSF does have a validator, so it does help us there. and there is a lack of utility modules. For some that maybe are familiar with like PyMisp, fantastic tool. We don't really have like a good Pi OCSF right now. There's a lack of the open source community in the OCSF channels. Now, luckily, we have a call to action. First and easy one is, if this is something that you think may help you, or either as a consumer or creator of scripts, or just threat intelligence. Maybe if you could still have your same reports, but maybe there's also another format. So they do have, the main website. The Slack channel is fantastic. They think they do PRs every Tuesday. And it's very curious seeing this Slack channel of a lot of competing vendors working together. It's kind of a unique place, and it's where we need to be. And of course, star another repo. Now, if you're like, okay, maybe I've done some of that. Maybe the next one is, let's look at implementing OCSF in some of our tools. One that is kind of a passion project right now is to try and migrate all the RMM lots and lot objects into these tools. I've done quite a few of them that I was most concerned with. A lot of my others are still in these other static scripts. So I'd love to build this. I don't know where it should be hosted. Luckily, the automation SIG has kind of relaunched, so maybe this is a topic for the automation SIG is just the formatted data. We have the scripts, we have the processes, but really it's some of these just objects that we might need now. And also, maybe if you are a script builder, try releasing a script or updating one in OCSF. If you're already parameterized, you can just add a new function that then call to just, hey, drop this in OCSF, but if people are still reliant on your old methods, you don't have to change anything. And lastly, for the go-getters, we don't have really any modules, so which would help 1 and 2 immensely, but we really need some sort of utility to help script builders, just like, pip import something. We don't really have that right now. So that is probably one of our biggest gaps, but it's also one of the biggest things we need to work on. And with that, thank you. And I really do believe that automation can, especially mixed with, our standards and community, that we can move that needle not just on this collective good, but we can also, maybe even reduce burnout just a little bit. And ideally, at least for me, get more of us outside. I love speaking on this last day because over the course of the week, getting to meet many of you, getting to learn about, your jobs and shop talk, but I also got to learn about what you do to recharge. And a great number of you go outside to do that. So it would also make me super happy just having more people getting outside. So thank you, and safe travels home.
Thank you, Mike. I felt like honey on automation souls which struggle. So and automation SIGA, I think, welcomes you warm-hearted to do that, and it's probably the right way of this non-vendor but integrative. So thank you very much. We have some time for questions. Please line up at the microphones. So Alex.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. Just one question, because I'm a bit confused with OCSF. So for the MISP project, we were maintaining around 300 MISP object templates that can be reused. They are freely available, functional. They are, as you mentioned, integrated with PyMISP and so on. And I'm just wondering why they created all those object templates in vacuum without actually using the tool and creating the tool at the beginning instead of creating just a template without having actual usage of it. So I'm just confused with the model of creation of those templates without to have actually the tools for doing it. So I don't know if you have an history about it and why it was like that.
I think as I understand it, you're asking why we're building objects in OCSF or not building them into the tool itself. I mean, for a lot of these, the tool just doesn't exist, or the tool is just some person's script. And unfortunately, and this may be a byproduct of generative AI, but unless you give generative AI really good instructions, the output is typically kind of hard-coded. You know, you don't get good parameterization. It doesn't set you up with maybe some sort of input config file. You know, it's just like, all right, I'm going to make it as quick as possible. Here it is. It often does get the job done, but it ends up being like point solutions. So ideally, if I had a script that's for doing something to this particular firewall's, this vendor, you know, I want that the object that might support it to be able to be used for any firewall vendor. I just don't want to do it for just this one. You know, I'm always concerned about, you know, vendor lock-in, and as a former developer, I guess still developer, I'm always looking at how to separate logic, you know, what the code does, and then with what the configuration is, and can I keep reusing that object? So for like uninstallation scripts, you know, you really is for like just Windows, you know, you're really just looking at like, okay, where's the, you know, Windows registries, which directories am I purging, which processes am I stopping, you know, so if you can reuse that same tool, it really saves us a ton of time, because now you don't have to look for a new script. We also can make iterative improvements on that one script. So we can actually, as a community, focus on this one script instead of a bunch of scripts.
Thank you.
We still have time for additional questions. Who is considering building some scripts to consume such objects or produce such objects? Great. So I hope the session was valuable, not only for you who just raised their hands, but for others to contemplate. I'm not sure if next week I'm going to jump into it, but let's see. So, Mike, thank you very much.